Hello and welcome everyone again to another episode of Transmissions. We have recently named it. Today we have Dr. Aiyana Willard, who finished her PhD at UBC and is now a reader at Brunel University. And for those who don't know what a reader is, it's apparently a high middle-ish position. It's a really weird name, but she's a reader. Brunel. She studies religion and atheism, so irreligion, and witchcraft and other woo stuff. And I think it's really interesting to understand how it relates to cultural evolution. So I'll let you take it on from here, Aiyana. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, about your work, how it relates to cultural evolution, etc.?
Yeah, sure. So first off, the academic ranks, the traditional academic ranks in British institutions where I currently am are lecturer, senior lecturer, reader, full professor. So I'm somewhere between senior lecturer and full professor. It's a strange system, I know. My favorite title, though, I wish they would let me just read. It would be exactly what I want to do all day. So my research looks, I look at the cultural evolution of religion broadly defined. So I look at all sorts of different belief systems and all sorts of things that are kind of not quite religion, so supernatural belief systems. And some currently I'm looking at kind of the cultural evolution of spiritual practices in the modern West, specifically neo-paganism, so revival of traditional pagan beliefs and witchcraft beliefs in the West and the magic in the West. I've done quite a lot of different things under this umbrella. So my work you can kind of split it into two parts. So a lot of my stuff looks at why people are religious. So why, human species as a species, religion is everywhere. We find it in every human culture in some form, something that we could call religion. And this is a really interesting question. Why is this true? So we can look at why we are as a species so religious. And a lot of the way we actually do this is by looking at reasons why people might leave religion. So it gives us some variation we can look at. So we're doing a lot of work right now looking at non-religious belief. So people's leaving religion and what kind of causes that. And so obviously not all of it explains why people have religion in the first place, but there are some really interesting things we can look at in terms of things like feelings of security, the needs that religion fills for people, and then some basic cognitive traits that lead people to have these supernatural beliefs. So if religion is everywhere, there's something underlying about how we think about the world or conceive the world that leads us to something supernatural. The way those kind of tendencies, those like vague supernatural tendencies would become religions that are shared by groups is a cultural evolutionary process. So it's fundamentally relevant to cultural evolution in that way, that you need to explain why our individual brains, who maybe have a bit of superstition and sort of the way we think about cause and effect leads us to having supernatural beliefs in ghosts and spirits or whatever, how that becomes these group level institutions of religion. And that goes for everything from small local religions and local groups to kind of big religions we see in the world today, like Christianity and Islam or Buddhism and Hinduism. Yeah. And then the other part of the work that I've done is stuff looking at sort of the cultural evolution of pro-social religion. So specifically looking at the moral aspects of religion and the norm enforcement aspects of religion. So this is most famously part of the big gods theory, the idea that there's certain types of high moralizing gods, which are innovations that allow people to live in these increasingly large societies by sort of punishing or giving sort of consequences for new types of normative behavior, new types of moral behavior that are more focused on sort of how you interact with anonymous strangers, things that expand your in-group beyond sort of your local ethnic group to all sorts of people. So all of a sudden you can go from the people you know, the people you kind of that look like you, to missionizing religions that will bring in any community and form a group identity around this kind of much broader idea where people will still share norms and beliefs and practices and kind of work across larger and larger groups. Yeah, so from there, one of the kind of things that we've been looking at more recently from there is how other sorts of belief systems, so not just these big god religions, which are primarily Christianity, Islam, that's kind of the classic. So how other sorts of religious practices might fit into some of these perspectives too. So like, what are these other groups? So Farrell, you've done a bunch of work recently on Hinduism that's looking at this topic in Hinduism, and I'm really very excited about that work. And I'll save it for some time when you get to tell when you're on this side of the
Yeah,
podcast.
just for anyone who's listening and is wondering how we're so casual, Aiyana is my supervisor, so I've known her for 3 years, so that's why we're like just chatting away. But Aiyana, some big words. I think let's like dilute it down. Let's just make it easier to understand. Big words like religion, which is, a really like big category. We've spoken about some cognitive biases. We've also spoken about cultural evolution as a whole, right? So why don't you just explain what you mean by each of these big terms to kind of make it easier to grasp? And
So we can start with religion as the hardest and most difficult to define. It's the biggest term and obviously important to define if you're studying it. There are literally thousands of years of debate around what the definition of religion is, and no one's come to a consensus. So we often deal with this in terms of we pick bits of religion we're interested in and study those that are easy to define. So ritual, beliefs, those sorts of things, like belief in God, those kinds of things. But generally, when I talk about religion, I'm talking about something that has some sort of supernatural, usually deity beliefs, ritual practices, and is functioning as kind of normative structure within a society. Those are kind of the three big things that I'm looking at. Cognitive biases.
Mhm.
Cognitive biases are essentially the way we look at them in religion. They're either content or context biases. So basically it's some way that either your brain has evolved or some consequence of the neural wiring in your brain that leads people to kind of prefer certain types of answers or over others, or pay attention to certain things over others, or in the term of context biases, learn in certain circumstances more readily than in others. So you learn from prestigious people, you learn from the sort of the majority conformity biases. And when we're looking at content, we're often looking at things like anthropomorphism, or the tendency to kind of we have this cognitive capacity. We've evolved this capacity to think about other human minds, and we're very effective at that. It's one of our great skills. We also use that to think about all sorts of other things. So we assign kind of human-like mental states or human-like beliefs to all sorts of complex processes in the world that it may be inappropriately. People think about the weather, their cars, their computers, their pets, any sort of complex causal process. We can use that kind of mental state reasoning to understand, and that's a type of anthropomorphism that potentially leads to supernatural beliefs. So that would be one type of cognitive bias. The other big one in religion is mind-body dualism. This is probably not something that's evolved for any particular reason. It's probably a consequence of how our brain is wired, but we tend to think of the thing that is your mind as being separate from your body. And it's very difficult to not do this. So the kind of classic example is like, if you and I switch bodies, would we still be the same? Would we still be us? And you can answer that question however you like, but the fact that you understand it is really odd. So that just
like
automatically
Freaky
makes sense.
Friday.
Yeah, I mean, if I said, if we switched our nervous systems, would be still the same, you would be like, what are you talking about? That doesn't, like, I can't even conceive of what that would be. So it's just a way we think about minds that makes them prone to, life after death. Ghosts can exist. Disembodied gods and spirits and stuff can exist because of that process. And what was the last one?
What's cultural? Like, how do you understand cultural evolution? Like,
Yeah,
what does that
the big one.
term mean for
The
you?
thing the most important part of this. So, I mean, cultural evolution is essentially it's sort of change in time over culture. So we're looking at things like variation and selection, inheritance of cultural traits that kind of build bigger or more adaptive, not necessarily bigger, but more adaptive cultural products. So we're looking at religion in terms of cultural evolution as how over time and over generations, different beliefs have either been selected for or selected against to become more adaptive to kind of fit the societies that people live in and the ecologies that people live in.
Yeah, it's really cool. I think I'll get into the nitty-gritty of it. So you spoke about context biases, you spoke about content biases, you've spoken about the general cognitive biases, and obviously we know that culture plays a huge role. So for religion, when it comes to religion, what do you think is the role? How does the nature and nurture bias fit into the religious context, according to you?
So if you are Muslim, the good chance that the biggest predictor of being Muslim is growing up in a Muslim family, right? Like, people do not spontaneously come up with a specific religion that is entirely cultural, right? Any kind of broad practices that we have, they're entirely learned, they're entirely cultural. If you weren't born into a religion, you came into it through some sort of other social connection. religion is entirely learned. What we do have is some tendency. I mean, when we think about, we're very prone to looking for causal reasons in the world as a species, as it's probably a very effective way to learn about the world. A lot of things are hard to understand, and we'll come up with reasons anyway. And a lot of those things are akin to supernatural beliefs. So that's kind of the nature side of it, is that like actually constantly coming up, being promiscuous causal reasoners, and always coming up by cause and effect in the world leads us to all sorts of things could potentially be supernatural. Why does it rain sometimes and not others without really complex scientific understanding of the world? The answer to that question is inevitably going to be something a bit supernatural. And that from those bases, we can build into these things that are entirely learned. But no one is innately religious. They don't become part of a group held cultural belief without learning it.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty of it for people who are aware or are not. So in the field, just to give a little bit of context, in the field of religion, I think there is this dominant theory. It's called, I guess, recently I read about it, the naturalness of religion hypothesis, or the
Yep.
naturalness hypothesis, which basically suggests that religion is innate and non-religion or irreligion is an anomaly, right? It's like you have to actively engage in analytical thinking, and that's how you can be irreligious or atheistic. So and there's a lot of like support for it, right? There's the byproduct theory according to which, we develop, like you said, mind-body dualism and anthropomorphism, these things for like different functions. We had hyper-agency detection device, which is like, oh, if someone's looking at us, we know that we're being hunted, and we kind of evolved it for like adaptive purposes. And it's believed that under the right pressures, they come together and allow us to be religious. And so the idea is we have all these like cognitive biases that you said, these content biases that predispose us towards religion. And I know that you have slightly different opinions on it. So can you like shed light on what they are, where they come from? What is this update? Like, what is this new update in the field? Because I know it's not super dominant yet. So it'd be really cool to get it out there, this narrative.
I think it's increasingly the dominant perspective that this is not the case. The naturalness hypothesis, the idea that religion is natural, comes from byproduct theory. It suggests that we've evolved all these capacities for religion. They're byproducts of so we've evolved them for other reasons, and religion is a byproduct of these processes, right? So we didn't evolve theory of mind to think about the mind of God, but having theory of mind allows us to think about gods and ghosts and spirits as having human-like minds. And that's just a byproduct function of this. Again, I think, you can't get to religion from there. You need some additional individual people don't create religion, groups of people create religion, which is this more cultural process. I think the other side of it that I find a bit confusing is I'm not sure what people think the alternative side is. So when we talk about things like analytic thinking, so there's a bit of evidence, very inconsistent evidence, that people who are better analytic thinkers are more likely to be non-religious. Their findings are pretty inconsistent, and they're consistently very small when they are found. It's not really clear what that means in terms of rationality or anything like that. It's a very small effect, and it differs from belief to belief and from population to population. But the thing that I find the most kind of difficult to grasp about that is what people think the alternative is. So this idea that we're completely rational scientific thinkers seems a bit baffling to me, considering science has existed for a few hundred years. Religion is so in that sense, people, the idea that religion is natural makes a bit more sense, because we're not naturalists, we're not naturally scientific thinkers. But I don't think that makes us inherently and obviously religious either, right? These are cultural structures. I think religion, the way we've defined religion, is sort of these spooky action at a distance, non-naturalistic processes in the world, ghost spirit stuff. And I do think we're very prone to that. And they're much more consistent and easy explanations than rational scientific ones that take essentially a lot of training. So, the reason that we are thinking this way and we work this way is because we have spent years and years and years in school learning to think this way. And a lot of people, even at that point, aren't great at it, right? Like, it takes a lot of effort to kind of think about the world naturalistically and scientifically. The place where I think I deviate from the kind of standard hypotheses is that doesn't get you, none of this gets you religion. You still need all of these cultural practices and learning practices. You can't it's not that just like a person left on their own would automatically become Christian. are Muslim or
Yeah.
Hindu.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now we've kind of established why religion is natural. We need a group of people. So then, why did we come to develop religion in the first place?
Um,
If it's not natural, if it's not inherent, what would explain why we have religion in the first
So I
place?
think this kind of comes back to this idea that religion is really hard to define. So for most of human history, the things that we would now consider religious would just be part of your broad cultural, they're going to be part of your political systems. They're going to be part of how you think about how do you get food, how do you so there's not really a lot of difference between kind of the supernatural. And so I guess I would say that supernatural beliefs tend to be quite natural. We tend towards these types of beliefs.
Mhm.
They're not considered by most people non-natural. They're not considered not scientific. They're not considered not rational. They're people trying to understand processes in the world and functions in the world and potentially getting those answers, coming up with answers that we wouldn't consider scientific, or we wouldn't now, given our body of scientific knowledge, consider naturalistic. But it's not clear that most people, for most of human history, or even today, think that way. I think one of the interesting places you can kind of look at this is in the modern West. If you look at sort of alternative spiritual, or even just like basic contemporary people and their concepts of how medicine works, or how you can heal illness or make yourself a better person, or just the kind of causal processes that function. You see this in like conspiracy belief and all sorts of things. We're not great at these naturalistic processes for complex systems, and we're really not good at just saying like, oh, that's too complicated, I can't understand the causal process, I'll just leave it for later. People want to know why things happen. And so I think that's, yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, you perfectly did. My question, let me clarify, is why are we then, okay, superstitions are natural, we use it, we explain the world. How did we come to have organized religion? It's pretty dominant. Like almost all nation states have some form of religion being practiced in them. So
Yeah. So, okay. So if we look at a small scale, so, the spectrum kind of goes from like these, you look at groups like the Hadza, which is one of the most studied hunter-gatherer populations, and they don't have organized religion in the way we would think about it. They do have beliefs. They do have supernatural beliefs. They have deities. They have all of this stuff, but there's not an organized religious practice. And if we're looking across, say, hunter-gatherer populations or early human populations, you would expect there would be the whole variation from like vaguely superstitious beliefs to organized religious beliefs, right? What we look at when we talk about cultural evolution of religion is why some of these types become more dominant. So the things that are more successful, these organized religions, are often more successful when they can help. So when beliefs get paired with rituals, they're easier to transmit. They have all of these other benefits like social bonding, et cetera, et cetera. So people are more likely to learn them and adopt them. And so supernatural beliefs paired with rituals are much more likely to become institutional beliefs or group held beliefs. And then when you have those and you kind of bring in sort of beliefs about supernatural punishment, or that, deities care about the things that you do, which is very natural for us. If you think it's something, if you think something has a human-like mind, it's probably also going to judge you, because that's how we think about human-like minds. There's social pressures. People care about what we do. So it makes sense that supernatural agents would care about what we do. So as soon as we start having these supernatural agents, they're potentially cared about our behavior. And if that behavior becomes things like whether or not you share food with your neighbors, or whether or not you steal or do any of these things, it's going to start helping to enforce normative behavior. So the kind of innovations of belief that these minds care about what you do, the things they care about are morally or normatively valenced, and that there's a punishment or consequence from that to your behavior, will start enforcing normative beliefs. And those beliefs can make groups do better. So they can make societies function better. They can make people more cooperative. They can do these things that sort of, you shouldn't exploit this land. There will be big bad consequences. Your family will all get sick. You shouldn't harm people. You shouldn't do these things. There will be supernatural consequences to those beliefs. And those beliefs tend to stick and stay. And so the reason we see these types of beliefs in the world today is because they're essentially just more successful.
so So if, all religions kind of, not all, let's talk about monotheistic religions, right? They're pretty dominant, like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they really dominant, the big group, super dominant religions today. So why is it that people, and I really want you to comment on why is it that, why is it just not one religion? Why are people not following, why is not everyone not following Judaism? Why is everyone not following Christianity or Islam? Why because this whole thing is about cultural evolution, which means cultural change. Why have religions changed? My friend, he was a Muslim friend of mine, and I really just didn't understand, because I'm a Hindu, and I just didn't understand how Judaism, Christianity, Islam were linked to one another. So he was like, think of them as iOS updates. Judaism is the oldest version. Christianity is like the updated version, and Islam is the most updated version. And I thought that was really cool. So keeping this analogy in mind, kind of like, why have we created different religions? Like, why do you think we keep having different religions? And then further into that, why do you think each religion keeps breaking into so many sects? It's so hard for me, because I just keep believing all Christians are the same. And I'm like, but you're Christian. And they'll be like, I'm Catholic. And I'm like, but to me, that's the same thing. So why do you think we're having these divisions? Can you take me through your mind about that?
Christianity and Islam are particularly successful because of the types of beliefs and norms that they enforce, right? They're not, I don't think we're likely to ever get to a place where we have one religion. There are always people who are going to deviate and believe something different. There's particularly in Western society, there's push now for individual belief systems. And this is how we see these all sorts of new religions sprouting up outside of the Western societies, but we see this everywhere, right? So there's always going to be variation of religious belief. I doubt we will ever come to the perfect belief system that dominates everything. But the Christianity and Islam have been particularly dominant because of the types of beliefs they hold, and they're specific to these kind of big God beliefs, right? They're very well adapted to these large scale living, to cooperation, to and they're missionizing religions. They're very good at spreading. So, the idea of creating these larger and larger group identities. So if you're Muslim, all the people who are Muslim together are part of your group, describe their ethnicity or anything like that. Obviously, we're humans and there's nuances to that, how actually people think about that, but that's one of the big innovations. And actually, I think Buddhism is the first religion that really starts doing this, right? Buddhism is kind of the first religion to start spreading around the world and sort of becoming this larger and larger world religion. It's just been somewhat less successful outside of Asian populations than I think, when these beliefs are very effective, but there are differences in groups and different needs. So, Catholicism and Buddhism both do this really well. They're very good at absorbing local traditions. So you have these other saints or bodhisattvas or all of these other kind of bits within the religion that you kind of just slot local deities into. And that's also a very effective way of spreading these kind of broad religious practices. Where schisms happen, they're often led by slightly different ideologies. So, I think, when we were talking earlier about this analytic thinking, I think people underestimate how much people think about, rationalize, and sort of analyze their own religious beliefs. And that's really common. And actually, often, if you look at where schisms happen in religions, it's over these I've spent a lot of time thinking very carefully about these practices, and I've come up with this problem, but these people disagree. I haven't convinced them, and you get these splits. Some of this is some of these groups become much more effective than others. I think right now, Mormonism and evangelical Christianity are really the ones spreading the fastest compared to most groups of Christianity. Culture changes, religions change, beliefs change, and religions split. Someday when we inevitably write the paper of what would happen if the God of evolutionary science of religion started with Hinduism instead of Christianity as its base, whether or not we would think of these as all Christians as one group or a bunch of different disparate groups. I think that's just a perspective of where we started from, rather than they're clearly related, but it's not clearly the same that they are actually all the same religion. It's just how we think about it because of how we think about Christianity.
That's really interesting. But I want to specifically poke about, when you say effectiveness, what do you mean by effectiveness, and what determines the efficacy of a religion?
How did I use that word?
I feel like,
okay, maybe effectiveness is not maybe the success of a religion. We think, so religions that are, there's going to be two parts of this, right? So religions that spread or have mechanisms that help them spread are going to be more effective. We talk a lot about credibility enhancing displays. So people who enforcing behavior that sort of supports belief. So people who put religions where people are visibly seen to be practicing their beliefs, more people are going to be more convinced by that, right? If you're saying, hey, you should do all of this costly stuff, you should give money to the church, you should dedicate all your time, and I look at you and you're not doing that, I'm going to be like, this is a scam. But
Mm-hmm.
we were more likely to kind of believe new members of society, whether they be children or immigrants, are more likely to see these kind of costly displays or these credible displays and be more convinced to adopt those beliefs than not. So there's something about the transmission types of beliefs we have. All the transmissibility really helps. The other side of it is essentially, is this, and this is where the kind of effectiveness and success side comes in, is this helpful? Are these beliefs in any way helpful for the group, right? And I mean that in terms of, are the people surviving and thriving within this group? Is the group cooperative? Is it working together? Are people functionally succeeding, right? And if you're from an outside group and you see more successful people in another group, that will help you, that will make it more likely that you convert to that group. So if people are surviving plagues because they're looking after the sick, because that's part of their religious belief, people are going to start converting to that belief. And this is one of the things that caught people to convert to Christianity. So taking care of your sick and having these practices, sharing food, taking care of other people, giving rights to women has been a really effective way for religions to spread in the early days. So both Christianity and Islam, they did this, and this is one of the ways that people start converting, because people in those groups do better, right, on average. You also get much more cohesive groups, and those cohesive groups can take over other groups, right? So if you have Christianity or Islam large enough groups that they can kind of become armies, they can take over new lands, convert people forcibly. If people are willing to missionize out because of they're willing to dedicate their life to this religion and go out and spread the belief, those things are going to spread as well.
That's really, really excellent. So now I think we've largely covered why religion exists, why we're religious, how it's helpful. It's helped us adapt. Religion changes over time. And we've kind of covered all of these X, Y, Z things about, why different religions exist. I want to now come to your more recent topic. I don't know if you're tired of it, because I know you've been working on it for 3 years with the Explaining Atheism project. So we've kind of covered, religion is important. It helps us. It makes sure, it supervises us. It makes sure that we're behaving, keeps us in line, gives us a normative system to work off of. So in this context, now that religion has become so dominant, which is now, it's the dominant mechanism through which we are thinking, where do you think atheism finds itself in there? And how do you think it's found itself and then now spread?
And I don't actually think that religion is the dominant way we think about the world anymore. And I think it hasn't been the case for a really long time. And this is part of why we're seeing increased atheism in certain parts of the world. So there's quite a few bits going on here. So essentially, religion is one part of culture that changes and adapts, and there's all of these other parts, and sometimes these parts don't match up. Religions are very conservative, not in the political sense, but in the sense that they have these really strong mechanisms for transmission that make it actually quite difficult for them to change norms and structures once they're well established. And so sometimes those become out of date. So there's this kind of contrast between what is politically savvy and what religion needs to change constantly to keep up with other parts of culture, and sometimes it fails at that. And that's one of the reasons that religion declines. A lot of it, when we look at the big theories of religious decline in the West, a lot of it is looking at essentially religion. The religions we see in the world today, these big religions, they adapted to meet needs we don't necessarily have anymore, right? So a lot of the needs that, if you were joining these big religious groups, some of the things that they helped you with were going to be things like, getting food, childcare, healthcare, those sorts of things. And those are all taken care of by secular institutions. So we have a level of security that leads to the kind of needs that we had for religion sort of declining in importance. And so what we see is that this doesn't necessarily mean people don't believe. So what happens in places, so this is true, Scandinavia being a kind of key example of this, of one of the least religious part of the world. But you can kind of follow this trend across a bunch of different Western societies. There hasn't been a lot of work outside of the West in this, all that's starting now. The trend is essentially, you get strong secular institutions, you have a welfare state, you have healthcare. People don't stop believing, but they stop practicing, right? So they stop spending as much time with their church, they stop going to church, they stop doing all of these costly, credible practices that we saw, and then the next generation becomes less religious. So people who are raised in a household where their parents are participating in their religion, even if their parents are strong believers and they have strong belief in God and they believe religion is great and all of those things, they're less likely to grow up to be religious because they're just not being taught that this is important and central to their cultural beliefs. So that's one of them, and that's probably the biggest one. I think the other really interesting kind of cultural change that's happening is that the domains in which religion is functional have shrunk, right? If we think of religion as being a lot of what religion does outside of these sort of pro-social aspects, and this has been much less studied, but it's starting to become more and more studied. It explains the world, right? Religion explains, it gives us a sense of meaning, a sense of coherence. It gives us some sort of structure to understand why things happen when they happen. But those domains are shrinking too. So, religion used to beliefs, these supernatural beliefs used to explain the weather. We have different explanations for the weather. We have different explanations for all of these other domains of knowledge that come from science, that come from our more secular knowledge. So what religion is doing is kind of becoming increasingly smaller. So how people are applying religion to understand the basic happenings in their life is just becoming less important for a lot of people as we have other ways of explaining those things.
Well, super interesting. I think I really like the point about how it's not lack of, being not religious, but it's lack of belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I kind of want you to explain the diversity in atheistic expression that can exist. Like often when I talk to people about atheism, I get really stumped because people just assume atheism is a very like naturalistic stance, almost like new atheism, and then everything else they put into agnosticism. And so atheism then becomes this classification referring to very, very specific people. So when you say atheism, can you like shed more light on that and how there is
Okay, so
diversity in atheistic?
atheism is another really tricky term. So there's the kind of politicized version of it. So I mean, the word just means lack of belief in God, and I don't even think that the people we generally classify as non-religious or atheist even fall into that category. So you get these kind of differing. So probably the better way is non-religious people. Non-religious, non-traditionally religious people would be kind of the bigger, broader category. For a place like the UK, those people are more than 50% of the population now. And this is true in lots of places in Europe. You go to places like the Czech Republic or Czechia and Estonia, and you're looking at the number of religious people is like between 10 and 20%. It's very, very low.
Mm.
But across those people who are not religious, you have a huge variety of stances. And the kind of pure naturalists don't believe in anything we would call supernatural are an incredibly small percentage of that. So most people hold some sort of supernatural beliefs, even if they don't think of themselves as supernatural believers. So if you ask people what they believe, most people, even if they can't name it, they say, well, I believe in something. Like there's something out there in the universe. There's some sort of power or force or energy or, intelligence that's sort of controlling things or holding some sort of, they believe in things like universal energy or universal power. There's very few people that have like purely naturalistic stances in the world. It's a very small percentage. But then across that, you have these large groups of people who are what we would call the spiritual but not religious. So people who hold supernatural beliefs, but they don't want to adhere to any specific religion, or they don't want to adhere to organized religions. We have an increasingly large number of people who, if you look at people who will like on a census say they're not religious, we have these larger and larger groups that are what we would consider religious, but they don't want to think of them. So they're following practices and standard practices, but they don't want to identify with religion because they consider religion something like Christianity or, the groups that we're looking at with like the neo-pagan goddess worshiping groups. Religion is patriarchal. Religion is these patriarchal structures, and these are feminist practices, therefore they're not religion. So there's a lot of confusion around on that sort of stuff. So it isn't the case that everyone who leaves religion or says they're not religious on a census doesn't hold supernatural beliefs. Most of those people do, even when that percentage is quite high.
Yeah, let's get into the woo stuff that you're studying, which is witchcraft.
Okay, so this is so we're doing a project right now looking at neo-pagan beliefs, and this is sort of come out of my broader interest in witchcraft. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about and reading about witchcraft and trying to get people to give me money to study witchcraft to limited success. So we've done some stuff in, I'm particularly interested in the kind of contemporary present day beliefs. So we've done some stuff in Mauritius on witchcraft beliefs that we published recently, and they're looking at how they're supporting certain types of normative practices around envy. And this is interesting to me because this is, again, it's a very wealthy, highly developed, well-educated contemporary society where these beliefs are quite common. But now we're looking at them in the UK and in the Western world more broadly, where you see these beliefs are increasing, right? So you can look at in the US, the estimate, I think the most recent estimate is 2014, and the estimate is there's about 1 million people who consider themselves witches or practice some sort of spellcraft and magic in the US. We look at neo-pagans in people we could classify as neo-pagans who either call themselves neo-pagans or Wiccans or Druids or any of these things in the UK. In the 2021 census, about 100,000 people who mark that on the census as their religion. I would say it's probably a huge underestimate because most people we talk to in these communities would say they're not religious, right? So they're practicing neo-paganism. So these are growing beliefs, and they're largely based around magical practices and spellcraft and like doing these rituals for magic purposes. And they have deities in them. They're complex sets of practices. They're very individualized in the sense that people can kind of pick and choose what they believe. They could pick and choose the practices they want. There's some core principles, but there's a fairly wide range. And this is true across the whole kind of New Age and spiritual but not religious movement in the West broadly. So what we're interested in is, why is this happening? Why are people picking these beliefs? What are these beliefs for? And so what we're looking at is how people are adapting and using these beliefs to essentially like deal with sort of the problems of modern everyday life in our crazy and uncertain times.
Why are they and I when you told me about this, I thought it was crazy. It was insane that it was happening so commonly in the UK, where there are so many secular institutions in place that should explain, like there's good medicine, there's access to free medicine.
Yeah, so
Okay, slowly, but it's really good.
So, I mean,
arguably.
if you look at what people are focusing on in these new religious movements, and there's quite a lot of work on this in sociology, and there's very little in psychology, but a lot of it is focused on them like, will these beliefs stay around because they're not really doing the same things that religion was? They're not filling the same niches as religion has been, and so the conclusion has been no. And I'm going fully the opposite. I think, yeah, no, they're probably going to have some staying power because they're not filling the same niches that religion has. So as religions fade, it's not that we don't need the types of broad security that we were getting from the Christian church. There's healthcare, there's all of these things, but people still have a lot of uncertain questions, right? This is the use of astrology or the use of tarot cards to answer basic questions about your future or your life. I think as our kind of contemporary world becomes a bit more fraught and a bit more uncertain, we're seeing this increasing turn to magic because people want to feel like they have some control over their world, right? So these are things that let you kind of feel like you're doing stuff, you're having some function in the world. And then if you look at the practices themselves, it's a lot so a lot of it is mindfulness meditation, things we would so if you look at how people train themselves to be, if you would want to become a witch in the modern West, you're going to be doing a lot of meditation. You're going to be doing a lot of things that kind of like calm your mind, help you think. And we know these things are extremely effective for people. There's a lot of research on this, on mindfulness practices that can be quite helpful for people to kind of just gently feel better about their lives and have a little bit more balanced mental states. A lot of the stuff is like therapy. So it's kind of figuring out how to cope better with your circumstances and how to, focus on the goals you want and try to bring about those goals by putting an effort towards them. So a lot of the ways that people look at magic practices and the kind of things that they're focusing on are things that either are out of their control, that they feel like they should have some control over, or things that are in there, so that's one side of it. But a lot of them are things that are kind of in your control. So it's like, hey, I would like to publish 3 papers this year. So I'm going to do a bunch of rituals. They're going to spend a lot of time focusing on that. And on some level, that does actually make people want to accomplish the goals that they've had. And we know this from different types of cognitive behavioral therapy, those sorts of things. So I think there's a lot of it is kind of making these actually somewhat effective mental health practices a bit more magical. And I don't think people are doing that consciously, but that is kind of what it looks like from the outside. And some of it is just, if if you can make your kind of mundane everyday existence a bit more spooky and a bit more magical, it's a little bit more fun. So a lot of things that people are doing spells and magic towards are like you can make cooking magical. You can make, the things you need to do every day, you can turn them into these ritual practices and make them a little bit more accessible and a little bit more fun to kind of motivate yourself to do stuff. There's lots of other benefits. People like connection to nature is a big one. So getting out, there's lots of usually exercise practices involved in these things. So people actually moving their bodies and going for nature walks and doing all of these things that I think are actually things that people feel like they're missing. So a lot of the practices we see coming out of witchcraft they look like the sort of thing that you would do to kind of just be a healthier, more functional person in society. I mean, that's one part of it. There is all of these other practices, and there's very much a variety.
And that's super cool because I asked, but I would like to believe I'm an atheist. I don't believe in religion, but it's like, I really believe in the evil eye. Like, "Boo, let's not talk about my PhD till it's done, otherwise I won't get it." And so,
Yeah.
and then recently, like every time I go through a breakup or every time I want to break up with my partner, you know what really helps me? Someone doing a tarot card reading for me and telling me
Yeah,
it's the right decision.
it's
Yeah, like
it's
I just need
it's
it.
very effective, and I think like when we have focused. So one of the things I think uh, that people studying anthropologists tend to study non-Western cultures. This is changing now, but a lot of it has
Yeah.
been. And psychologists tend to study Western cultures, and psychologists don't talk to people often. They often don't. There, a lot of it is questionnaires. They don't interact with their subjects. I think there's a lot you can get from. We talk about these things like the weird people problem or all of these things, but a lot of that even extends to just the people that we're actually interacting with and how we're interacting. Most people in the
Mhm.
world are not undergraduate university students in
Mm.
surveys. So you don't actually have to go that far from home to find some really interesting nuances to human existence and to our cultural practices. And so, we're going just down the road to a town that is completely neo-pagans. So, they live by the wheel of the year ritual calendar, 8 festivals a year, everything is nature based. It's a very fun, it's a very cool practice. Right? And it's 2 hours from my house.
Yeah. Yeah, I have increasingly more respect for them, they go hardcore. They believe
I'm into this, I've been learning a lot about because we've been going to these festivals. And so, we did the Yule festival, which is sort of the New Year's one, and it's a lot about, you know, the Yule is a time where you shouldn't be doing much because it's dark, weather's shitty.
Mm.
You don't want to like you should be. It's a time for rest. It's a time for relaxation. And I'm like, I can get into this. And like New Year's resolutions should happen in the spring when everything is new and you want to do stuff again. I'm like, honestly, I'm into this. That's my new. This is my new. I'm gonna make New Year's resolutions on the spring equinox when like flowers are blooming. I'm like, yeah, I am gonna run more. I am gonna do all of this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm motivated.
Yeah.
Right. December, January
I
is
think
not a good time to change your life.
I think that itself speaks to how adaptive just a superstitious belief is, right? Like it's like I don't want to do it. I'm not vibing with it. So I'm just gonna create this new set of norms that kind of helps me vibe, which is like I don't want to go for a run at night and I have a great excuse for it. I'm like,
I
I'm not
mean,
tuning in.
like anything, it's not that all of these beliefs or all of the beliefs in these practices are adaptive. There's a wide variety of them, but the ones that we expect and we will track to see that will be more expected or more widespread and more adopted and more kind of interacted with by people, we think will be these kind of more adaptive ones that are functionally doing something for people and some of the needs that we have in our crazy modern high-paced existence where people rent houses and no one has a permanent job. Like all of these things are true. There's different sets of needs than we had than when we were like living in ancient Roman cities and there were plagues with different needs,
I don't
different
know.
norms, different.
I don't
Yeah.
know. No, but so you don't think that do you agree that everything that sustains for a really long time will have an adaptive purpose, or do you think things can just survive culturally because of
I think
randomness?
we underestimate the rate of cultural drift. So things that are just not maladaptive or adaptive just exist and they don't really change because there's not really
Mm.
pressure either way. I think huge amounts of culture are that. I think the adaptive ones tell us some interesting stuff about humans and human society and how we function, so we focus on them. I think you can sustain maladaptive practices, and there's lots of examples of this in religion through like strong transmission mechanisms and these sorts of things, right? So
Mhm.
if you have really powerful transmission mechanisms, people can do all sorts of crazy things. most of them, the kind of classic one that everyone talks about is the Shakers, who were a group practiced celibacy. They were a Christian utopian group. They disappeared right away, well, really quickly, because even you can gain a lot of people initially with your practices. No one has kids. It's going to disappear, and
Mm.
eventually these things practice. So they generally do disappear, but people can maintain pretty maladaptive practices for a reasonably long time.
So how do you discern between, what stayed back and what is the adaptive or functional value of something? How do we discern, how even with religion, even with maybe any other cultural artifacts that may be?
So, I mean, some of it is things that we are just, within cultural evolution, there are, particularly within the cooperation pro-social domain, there's a lot of stuff we can look formally at modeling. So what are the benefits? What are the costs and benefits of these things that give us some sort of theory that we can then test in the real world? And so we have these ideas of how selection happens based on benefits. Measuring those actual benefits in the real world can be quite difficult. So for things like basic cooperation, we can make some pretty good guesses. But if you're doing some of the stuff that I'm doing now, and it's like, hey, doing some like slightly meditative practices and feeling a little bit more secure in your life might be beneficial. That's really hard to measure. It's actually very difficult. So we're actually borrowing from psychology, where they're measuring, the actual adaptive benefits of these practices outside of magic. So things that look very similar to what we're looking at, we're kind of borrowing some effects from there. We're looking at overall sort of people's perceptions of their own well-being, and their own effectiveness. But for a lot of these practices that we're looking at, it's probably the case that there isn't strong selection against them. They are time consuming, but they're not overly time consuming. They're probably not interfering with people's lives. So there's not necessarily going to be that kind of strong selection against them. I mean, if you're living
Mm.
in Glastonbury and which Glastonbury being our field site, and you're like dedicated your entire life to these practices, there is obviously some cost to that. Within that community, it's very, very adaptive. There's a lot of prestige associated with this. There's a lot of
Mm.
everyone is doing it. We have a great quote from one of our interviews, in which our postdoc just asked the person how they learned about witchcraft beliefs, and the answer is just like, well, everyone knows about witchcraft beliefs. Like, it's just like common knowledge.
This thing. Yeah.
And I think like that is, those environments do exist, and that's kind of a nice example of what it's like to live in that kind of little isolated.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. That's wow. Yeah, I personally find your witchcraft stuff super interesting because it's like I just can't wrap my head around how we've gone back to doing stuff that we
Well,
were
I
burned down
don't know
for.
if they ever. I mean, these are not things that ever really disappeared, right? They're kind of constantly in the background. So you get a lot of the revival of this. So I some of this stuff came out of reading a bunch of sociology on like spiritual but not religious and New Age beliefs, where they talked about how these things don't have staying power, and they're also referring back to like Aleister Crowley and like the kind of New Thought movements and all of these things. And I'm like, this is you're going back hundreds of years at this point. You're looking like, there's ceremonial magic practices that have existed forever. We don't see like consistent pagan witchcraft practices. This is not something to see, but like, there were cunning folk, there were practicing magicians, there were people who did all of these things, there were healers, like pretty much consistently throughout Western culture. It never really disappeared. It just sort of mutated and changed. It's kind of always existed in the background. What's happening
Mm.
now, it's becoming increasingly, it's spreading through social media, it's spreading through these pop cultures. People can dabble in it. And what's interesting to us is that you get people who are leaving um, traditional established religions, and they're just starting to dabble in magic because why not?
Yeah.
You too can be a witch. You can buy a kit. I guarantee you can find someone who will sell you some candles and some herbs and a little thing you could learn to cast a circle from a book or the internet. You too could be
Yeah.
a witch by the end of the day.
Yeah. No, I could. I think so. I think I would play the part pretty well with my hair and my nose.
The
I was
people who
always
do
called
it,
a
the
witch.
people who there is like the kind of formal practices have initiations, and they have long-term training, and they have all of these things. But you can be a hedge witch. You can be your own little individual. You could tap into your
Yeah.
magic.
Start my own thing.
But there is the people who do. There is a lot you can spend. You could really dedicate your life to this as well as dabbling.
How exciting as a new career prospect if academia doesn't work out.
If academia doesn't work out, you can become a witch.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. That's what I've gotten out of it. Okay, but with that, it's time to wrap. And it's time to wrap with a little bit of propaganda, which is, can you tell us why cultural evolution is cool and why cultural evolution society is even cooler and why people should come join us and be a part of this society?
Cultural evolution is cool because it gives us a strong and well evidence-based theoretical framework in which to explain human behavior. So, I'm a psychologist, which is a field where just 1,000 theories bloom. There's no real consistent structure. And I think cultural evolution gives us some of that structure that allows us to kind of make better predictions and better, we can come up with better, more realistic hypotheses that are not just pulling stuff out of thin air. And that leads to better science, right? The theory we start with is one of the huge problems in the replication crisis and all of these other things. I think we get better answers, we get better, we start from a better place, we have kind of build a larger and larger structure of knowledge. I think this is where we need to go in the future, and cultural evolution is very clearly, to me, the way to do that, to build these types of theories, because it's grounded in actual formal theory and, biology and all of these things. So we can build up from biology into kind of, we can go from biology to rocket ships and have some sort of consistent theory of how we got there.
Yeah.
Cultural Evolution Society is my favorite academic society. Maybe you need to cut that out because I'm also the president of another academic society, which is also evolutionary.
This is why I need to keep it in.
You need to keep it. President of the International Association of the Cognitive and Evolutionary Science of Religion, which is also has a lot of cultural evolutionary work in it as well. But it's a very supportive and just a really nice community. The conferences are really fun and just very inspiring, and the people are very inspiring. And I just like how welcoming and inclusive the community tries to be, and how they're adapting to fit into new societies and new structures, and they're fitting our kind of modern. They're being conscious of how they can adapt to fit into the modern crazy world we live in a little bit better.
That's so true. Yeah. Thank you so much, Aiyana. Just by the way, I am here because if you like one day Aiyana was like, you should apply for this. And I'm like, I don't even know what this is. She's like, no, you should do it. This is a great opportunity. And now here I am. So I
Glad I
think
could be of
Aiyana could get you. Yeah. Okay. But with that, it's time to wrap. Thank you so much for your time. I had a great time as always. I can yarn with you for days and days and never get tired. But yeah, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to, talking to you more as soon as I cut this call. Okay. Okay. Bye, Anna. Thank you.